So, hello there, everyone. I'm joined here by Eros. How's it going, Eros?
Doing well, man. How are you?
Yeah, very, very well. So, we left off in terms of our last discussion, specifically speaking about plasma entities and I guess the theogony of plasma entities and how this relates to perhaps the Nephilim, what we see in terms of the Book of Enoch and Shem Yaza. Um, there's a lot of things I want to touch upon. I've got a whole list of quotes here, but just to sort of kick us off, if you can give us a sort of recap of these occult bloodlines, how it ties in with the Nephilim, how that ties into Draco, and you also mentioned something I found pretty profound. Unfortunately, we got cut off. We got cut off from StreamYard and we had to jump over to here, and it sort of created a disjointed effect within the conversation. So we missed fully fleshing out this point. But you brought up the idea when Jesus was casting demons out of out of the afflicted, that the demon proclaimed that we are legion, and you were making a very profound point regarding that. I don't know if you can recall it, but perhaps if you could touch upon that too.
Um, I don't recall off the top of my head. I know I've been busy, and then we've had other discussions come up, so I don't remember what it was about Legion specifically. In terms of, so was it regarding like possession? Um,
Regarding
I
possession, yeah.
yeah, if I can remember in terms of that specific context. I mean, oh, you know what it might have been is in that text, the the demoniac, he's filled with many different demons or entities, and they're engaging with Jesus, and they say basically to him, "What have we to do with you, you son, thou son of God?" And there's different translations, whether it's Luke or Matthew or what have you, but essentially, have you come to torment us before the time, like the appointed time? And they basically beg of him to not cast them out completely out of the physical body, but they say, allow us to go into that herd of swine off there in the distance or what have you. And then Jesus grants them that and says, fine, go ahead. And then they depart from the demoniac and physically possess the herd of swine. Um, and so this is interesting because within this biblical context, we could see that possession is not necessarily limited to the human. While the human may be the goal or the primary target or the highest target to choose for a point of possession, it's not necessarily so. The demons obviously have a hierarchical understanding in terms of priority or preference to enter in physicality. And we don't exactly know how far this will go. Again, if you look into occult lore and studies of the paranormal, there appears to be possession even of objects, right? In voodoo, you have like different objects, dolls, caricatures, stones,
From
woodworking, trees.
from pop
I'm sorry.
culture, one thing comes to mind from pop culture, which is Annabelle. That
Yes.
well, it was a sort of story and it was made into a movie, so similar to that.
hmm And when a sort of active mitochondrial based nervous system cannot be accessed, they settle for whatever physicality they can get. So you have poltergeist phenomenon, you have like aports, which are where like a physical object seems to disappear and reappear in a different position. So in certain paranormal studies, there'll be like a watch on the table or a glass or a stone or whatever it is, and it'll be like placed on the table. It's grandma's house. This is where it always is. Everything's covered in dust. She doesn't move anything, and all of a sudden it's gone. And then later they demo the house a year later after grandma passes, and they find that same teacup or stone, wedged in the wall, in a void in the wall and there's been no cuts in the wall. No one opened up the wall to put it in there, but it's sitting in there like in the insulation. It's like, how did that get in there? That would be an example of like an aport, where it's essentially as like a teleportation of an item. And in the various occult literature, but particularly in the voodoo tradition, the possession of a particular item is of extreme importance, and there's a link that's essentially established between the fetch, if you will, or the voodoo object and the practitioner. And often, depending on which tradition it is and the specificities of it, daily, weekly, monthly, or on specific times of the year, sacrifices are made to it. See this a lot in South America, where it's like cigars or cigarillos will be offered, shots of whiskey, food, or even animal sacrifice up into human sacrifice are offered to the idol, which at least belief is that some kind of entity, some kind of plasma entity, or they're called in some traditions the bright ones or the shining ones, have taken up residence there in the physicality.
And
Um,
interesting as well, Nakash, which is the Hebrew for serpent, also derives from an etymological root meaning the shining one. So you see that
mhm.
connection there, interesting, between the serpent, Draco, and the shining one.
Yeah, there's an intimate connection between this sort of reptilian theme along with shining or bright or this sort of like fiery plasmatic beings, which, and as soon as we say fire, we're talking jinn as well. Again, the Apostle Paul on the road, right, to Damascus, has a view of what he thinks is Christ, and it's this shining being, and it basically burns his eyes, turns him blind for some time, right? And this has also been reported in UFO literature as well, though, where people will have interactions with balls of plasma, or what they think are UFOs, but they sort of morph into balls of plasmas and then change shape and turn into a UFO. And they will often have radiation, essentially burns on their body, physical burns on their body when they're in close enough proximity to it, or burns on their eyes, similar to the Apostle Paul. So we see a lot of these same trends throughout in this modern day in paranormal research, but also in a lot of the ancient texts as well.
So moving on to the occult bloodlines specifically, I was reading Peter Mark Adams' work, The Game of Saturn. I still haven't finished it yet, but he mentioned this, and this is sort of a slight paraphrasing, because he doesn't, it's from different sections, but he states, quote, "The earliest European royal line, the Merovingians, claimed descent from a sea serpent called a quinotaur, and many later European patrician families incorporated the serpent dragon into their coat of arms. The Visconti Dukes of Milan sported a biscione on their coat of arms between the 11th and 15th centuries, after which it was transferred to the Sforza coat of arms. The serpent is depicted devouring a child, though the impact of this representation is usually softened by interpreting the figure as a Moor instead. And then, interestingly, of course, we go to Shemyaza, and it states in the Book of Enoch that one of the apocryphal writings, Shemyaza, is portrayed as the leader of a band of angels called the Sons of God, or the Watchers, or Grigori. This also ties into the Nephilim once they started mating with human women and producing offspring. Shemyaza is introduced in Book 6, heading a meeting of a total of 200 angels, wherein they discuss their desire to consummate with human women, as mentioned. And Shemyaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us all swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations or oaths of death and curses, not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. Then swear they all together and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. So, firstly, first question, or first point rather, is that what we're seeing there is almost the precursor of a secret society, interestingly, which is what effectively composes the structure of our own ruling class and our own transnational ruling elite. And moreover, as well, you see this connection between um, half human, half, let's say, metaphysical being, or whatever it may be. I'll leave it up to you to describe what your opinions are on this, and forming civilization and forming the dynasties that would direct the human species vis-a-vis the instrument of civilization, which is a domesticating instrument. What are your opinions upon this, and how does this tie into the grander, um, your grander vision of civilization and perhaps the cosmos itself?
Yeah. Yeah. So, all right, we got it. I guess we should probably get into some of the weeds of the biblical situation here, from which a lot of this is flowering out of, and it's a bit confusing, and you kind of have to dance between narratives here to try to get a triangulation on what may be happening. Um, and so it's pretty murky water. So if we look at the book of Enoch, right, which is an apocryphal text, it has direct relations to the book of Jude and Second Peter in the New Testament, right? Because they're basically quoting from Enoch. Now, Enoch is and this is sort of like a huge debate in like biblical scholarship. Um, I lean more on the side that, along with Enoch, Second Peter, Jude, and I will also throw in James, the book of James, not for any reason connected to Enoch, but James. If you read the book of James in the New Testament, he's directly contradicting Paul, specifically Paul's letter to the Galatians. So it's my opinion that the book of James was a letter written by a certain sect of Jews that essentially had during the immediately following the time of Christ broken off, led by James, and James and Paul were directly at odds with each other. And James was essentially teaching, because if you actually just go line by the book of Galatians, read the book of Galatians by Paul, read the book of James by James, and you will see word for word, verse for verse, they're essentially contradicting each other, because it was a polemic against both positions. Paul arguing for justification through faith alone, and James saying that justification through faith alone is not sufficient. I believe this text was added intentionally to cause distortion in the general narrative of the text, and you can't tell if James is legitimate or if Paul is legitimate, right? It's introducing a dialectic in the text. But James is problematic, and he's part of what's called the Zadik heresy. There was a group of Jews called the Zaddiq, and they're actually linked up with a group of assassins. And there's a good book to read on this, but I may mention another time. Um, and but Jude and Second Peter are directly connected to Enoch. Um, and so there is an argument to be made that these books are infiltrations into a text, because the book of Enoch is hypothesized to have come from the Babylonian captivity. When the Jews were taken captive by the Babylonians, that's the time that this would have shown up. The case to be made for that historically is that at that point, the Jews had this disposition that they had been completely abandoned by Yahweh. And so sort of there was a fusion of Babylonian influence of like the Magi, and a fusion of that with Judaism. And from that, you get the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? Sects that come after that, after the Babylonian captivity. And with that, at the same time, you have sort of like the book of Enoch as well. So there's an argument to be made that this is all just Jewish mysticism being thrown onto or attached onto possibly earlier Hebraic texts. And it's confusing because the book of Enoch is pretty contradictory. So we know that something is up, because like in I think it's in Enoch chapter 8 and chapter 10, but I think also in Enoch 1. It's been so long since I've read it, but it essentially states that Azazel is I forgot, I think it's the archangel Gabriel imprisons Azazel in a cave in the desert. Um, Now this directly contradicts other texts, because in Enoch makes it very clear that the Watchers are supposed to be imprisoned under the earth in Tartarus, and you see this in Jude chapter 6, I think it is, where it says, "The angels which kept not their first estate, but left their habitation, he hath reserved everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of that great day. And then 2 Peter 2 says, if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, which is Tartarus in the Greek, and delivered them unto the chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. So the classic position, and you see this promoted by like Rob Skiba and Michael Heiser, which are two of the biggest proponents of the Enochian Watcher, basically doctrine. They state that all of the Watchers, all 200, but especially Shamzaza or Azazel, they're imprisoned under the earth, literally physically imprisoned under the ground, and then at an appointed time they will be released onto the earth. But Enoch contradicts that, because Enoch says very clearly that Azazel he's in the desert, in some desert in the Middle East, in some cave where Gabriel essentially put him there. So he's not under the earth. But then other texts and Enoch itself, Enoch chapter 21 says that they're imprisoned down there forever as well. So there's contradiction here. So it's hard to parse, what parts of Enoch would be legitimate, what parts can work well with other texts. And it's kind of like a poisoning of the well. Once we have internal contradiction within Enoch, then that's going to spread to the legitimacy of Jude and 2 Peter, because whoever wrote Jude and 2 Peter is quoting Enoch as an authoritative matter, right, in terms of biblical matter. And then the church says that 2 Peter and Jude are canonical, but it doesn't say that Enoch is canonical. So it's just a mess, right? So just to get some of like the biblical scholarship out of the way, is that we're sort of dealing with inherent contradiction within the text, and we're dealing with an issue in terms of the construction of the canon of Scripture itself, where there's a good argument to be made that Jude, 2 Peter, should not even be in the New Testament, right? For which you'll catch a ton of flack within the Christian community, but it is what it is. So all that being said, as while we pull different ideas from these texts, we do have to keep in mind that there's severe canonical issues and contradictory issues. We don't know, for example, where Azazel is. Is he in the desert, right, or is he under the earth in Tartarus, right? Because we have confirmation that he's in both places. Isaiah 13, Isaiah 34, if I remember, talks about essentially demonic spirits being in the desert, right? And that would also seem to contradict Enoch, because they're all supposed to be under the earth. So, it's confusing. But getting down to the angelic interaction with women, this can go either way as well, because a lot of Christians will quote Luke chapter 20, where it's talking about like after the resurrection from the dead, man and woman are not given, they're not neither married nor given in marriage, right? And it says the same thing about the angels. So your average Christian is going to think, and this is going to be like 95% of Christians, that when they see marriage, they think sex, right? So they say, oh, it says the angels neither marry nor are given in marriage. And then it even says, like, after the resurrection from the dead, Luke chapter 20, humans neither marry or are given in marriage. Well, we need to ask the question, you got to get a little philosophical, what does marriage even mean? And from a biblical perspective, marriage is essentially, if we're taking it out of Judaism here, out of the Old Testament, marriage is a financial contract. Before marriage is instituted primarily by Moses and what have you, but even before then with Abraham, it's essentially like concubinage is pretty much how things go. Marriage is detailed very specifically within the Judaic framework. Marriage is when a man gives a virgin a dowry, right? So you got to give a virgin a dowry. Upon giving the virgin a dowry, she is to be your bride, your wife, and there's very strict laws that woman cannot step outside of the marriage sexually, and that's to sort of perpetuate a specific bloodline under this contract of marriage. But you literally have to pay for her virginity, a dowry, and it comes out to, I think, in our modern after inflation, you'd have to pay anywhere between $70,000 to $100,000 to a woman for her virginity to secure the specific bloodline. So that's what marriage is. And when Jesus says that the angels are not given in marriage, and when he says that after the resurrection, man and woman will not marry or they're not given in marriage, he's he's saying that within a Judaic framework. So you have to get the definition of the terms from the Old Testament because that's what he's referring to. He's talking to Jews. He's a Jew, right? So that's when they say marriage, they mean dowry. So when Jesus, just to push this argument out of the way right away, is that, oh, angels can't, no other being can, mate with a human because they're not given in marriage. What Jesus is saying is that after the resurrection, there's no necessity for the institution, the legal, financial agreements of marriage anymore. And that's because this whole like reproductive situation and the establishment of bloodlines will no longer be necessary. So I'm just trying to get ahead of a few different arguments here because people fall pretty heavily on either side here. And if we're going to take information from the biblical text, we have to look at the entire canon. We have to get our definition of the terms, very critical, from the text itself. This is called exegesis or attempting proper exegesis of the text. So getting that out of the way, you can probably see that we're kind of in a muddy situation here. We don't know who wrote Enoch really. We don't know how consistent it really is and applicable. There's issues with the New Testament, so the texts we're pulling from are just really murky. And then on top of that, you have counter argument though, where it's like, well, it's not precluded that an angel or a plasma being could not in some way mate with a woman because the text never really denies that kind of possibility, right? Um, and how that whole process works is a bit of a different situation. But the Old Testament specifically is very concerned about the establishment and the purity of certain bloodlines. And that's why there's very strict regulations given in the Old Testament, Leviticus 18 primarily, talking about sexual laws and regulations on what exactly is to be done, who you can mate with, who you can't mate with. It's all about the establishment and the purity of certain bloodlines. So now, why that be the case is we can get into, but I kind of went down this rabbit hole here. Bring me back on track again with your exact questions in terms of the bloodlines.
Well, I actually think that's a very, a very uh, significant or important thing you've brought up there, because well, Enoch is it's pseudepigraphical, so we have to lay that out firmly. And fundamentally, what you're seeing here, similar perhaps to what you see with Kabbalah, is this fundamentally it's an expansion or an explanation, a model to find the exceptions within the Torah, right? And in terms of Enoch, what you're seeing here is a mixture of fundamentally a whole cacophony of various, perhaps neighboring viewpoints. So, like what you're saying, it's perhaps not entirely Jewish in origin. So that itself is important to lay out. But touching upon this idea that perhaps we see, not, of course, not just in the Book of Enoch. We even have the Irish Celtic fairy spirits, the Lanon Shi, who are detailed as being sort of bioplasmic entities that tether to their victims. It's stated by Nigel Pennick, quote, once so trapped, she siphons the vital fire from her lover, and slowly he wastes away, spellbound, hopeless for release. So fundamentally, the question is, why are all of these European royal families, these dynasties, of course, not even European, transnational capital dynasties, why are they tracing back to a sort of draconic bloodline, so to say?
Mm-hmm.
What's going on
Mm-hmm.
there in terms of your opinion?
Yeah. So we could approach this from a bit of a biblical perspective. The in Genesis it talks about the serpent being like the most cunning of all of the the uh, the animals or created beings or what have you. And so I this gets a bit into genetics, and we're going to kind of maybe get into some sensitive topics, I suppose, maybe for certain people. But regardless of what you think about like the Book of Enoch and its canonicity and whether or not this whole um, story or lineage of angelic, aka serpentine, inbreeding with humanity is literal or more mythopoeic, what we do apparently see within the biological genetic realm is that who your parents are matters physically, right? In terms of there are certain genetic dispositions that are granted via reproduction through the bloodlines that are going to grant or remove, depending on the situation, certain abilities, tendencies, dispositions in yourself or in another person, which is just another way of saying, like, you get dealt a certain genetic hand, and there's nothing that you can do necessarily, at least up until the modern day. This is maybe a different point for a little bit later, to really change that very much. There is sort of like an epigenetic phenomenon where you can like turn on and off certain genes and have some modification for that. And that gets into the importance of evolution and perturbation and all these other things. But there's some very curious, things when you look at the human genome that are pointing in a very specific like direction. So for example, um, one of the main things that make us human, from like a genetic perspective, is our frontal cortex, right? The neocortex. And we have like the most developed neocortex that we know of on the planet. Now, there's a specific part of that neocortex called the PMFC, or the posterior medial frontal cortex, and it's part of that frontal lobe. And the development of the PMFC is absolutely critical, actually. And this is going to start to connect into deeper conspiratorial things I've maybe kind of hinted at before. That irregular development of the PMFC actually is one of the indicators for autism spectrum disorder and OCD, right? And we're seeing a rapid increase of people being born on the spectrum, primarily males, but females are trailing close behind. As I mentioned before, I think by 2045, 2050, the estimate is that every male child born will be somewhere on the spectrum. So we're seeing that there's critical issues with frontal cortex development, specifically PMFC. And this is also related to the FOXP2 gene. Now, FOXP2 gene is one of the most important genes that we have. We share it with some other animals. FOXP2 basically allows for the development of language, right? And language to the high degree that we have. Now, I know, as you know, we probably mentioned this before, but maybe we haven't gotten too deep into it. But language is absolutely critical for the establishment, like, of Geist, right? The establishment of, because language essentially, modifications to language and your ability to engage with the world in that abstract manner is mediated through language. And this is why language is so important in psyops, but language, the development of languages and cultures, can actually change entire ways that people view and interact with the world. And the primary driver for language development is FOXP2. But FOXP2 is related to the PMFC, prefrontal medial, the posterior medial frontal cortex. Now, what does this have to do with like bloodlines and development of history and what have you? Well, the PMFC is very, very interesting, and it's a massive conundrum for humanity. The PMFC is essentially on a physical level in terms of our brain. Now, I mean, I know people are going to say, well, the brain's like an antenna, it's picking up frequencies, which I pretty much agree with, but how that antenna is tuned by the neuro development, by the neurochemistry, is going to change what frequencies you can and can't pick up, right? So again, we're still, the physical matters. You can't escape the physical situation. I'm never going to dunk on Michael Jordan, right? Speak, that like I can't change that. That's not something that's going to happen with like just my natural born abilities. So the same thing applies to our brain. You know, as soon as we get to the brain, everybody wants to disregard biology. They'll say, "Oh man, you're a 250-pound Nordic guy, and you could just, squat, 700 pounds, and that's good genetics, man." And then, "Oh man, you're super fast," or "Man, it's great genetics, man. You can jump high, great genetics." But then when it comes to the brain, genetics, no one wants to play that game anymore, right? That's when it's actually most clearly seen, because the ability to lift those weights and jump high and everything is all modulated and controlled by the brain. So that it's very much still a reality in that area. So there is a study in 2013 and 2015 at York University and UCLA. And this study employed transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's where they take magnets and they use magnets, it's electromagnetic, like essentially pulsations, onto the posterior medial frontal cortex. And what they were able to do is suppress activity of the PMFC or increase activity, depending on how they manipulated the magnets and the electrical currents that were working through this whole process with the brain. Now, here's what they found that's that the PMFC essentially controls your ability to identify problems and to work on solutions for those problems. And what it does is, being in that frontal neocortex area, is that it uses your ability of abstraction to simulate um, potentialities, to work and to combine those potentialities like a puzzle, like Legos essentially, to combine those potentialities into a possible new arrangement of a series of circumstances to allow you to solve a problem that it has identified as a problem. Okay, like I can't reach that apple in the tree. How do we do this? Let's stack some stones and climb up. Okay, that's your PMFC working. So the more you increase that ability, the more you basically charge that part of the brain, the greater that ability increases. Now, here's what these studies found out, though, is that to the degree that the PMFC is developed or energized, essentially, to the same degree, um, dispositions of closed-mindedness, racism, and belief in God increase. To the degree that they, through these transcranial magnetic influences, decreased activity of the PMFC, belief in God, or lack of belief in God, increased, atheism increased, liberal dispositions increased, and and dispositions specifically towards foreigners who were critical of yourself or your people or your culture, critical, even hostile to it, openness to those foreigners who are being presented essentially as a threat, openness to them increased. So what they basically found is that depending on the development of and the energization of this specific part of the brain depends basically on how liberal or conservative you are. Okay. Now here's the catch. The more conservative you are, the better you are at solving problems, identifying and solving problems. The less conservative you are, the less you are able to identify and solve problems. So it's an inverse relation. Now here's the problem, is that in order to develop and evolve and survive as a human, you have to identify and solve problems ipso facto. Walking to your car, if there's ice on the ground, you got to walk around it. Identifying and solving problems. So you need the PMFC in order to get through your daily life, and not just get through it, but to progress and thrive in all aspects. It's all about solving problems, life, right? To achieve those goals. But the better you are doing that, the more susceptible you are to being highly conserved in your viewpoints. The other kicker is that the more that PMFC is activated, the more you are conservative in your viewpoints, the better you are at identifying and solving problems, but the higher your ability for cognitive dissonance, which means that you're going to conserve around a particular viewpoint, be it socio-political, economic, or religious, but primarily religious viewpoints. You'll conserve around it. You will basically deny, and no matter what evidence is presented to you that would basically implore you to change your disposition, you're hyper conserved, you're hyper territorialized, and that means that what ends up happening is that your brain will initiate cognitive dissonance for you, so that, hey, look, this shows that this and this is actually incorrect about your particular religious belief, or your belief about this certain race of people is incorrect. You will employ cognitive dissonance to maintain the status quo. So you'll say, no, well, that can't be true because X, Y, or Z, or you'll just outright deny it. So we have a problem here, is that part of the engine of history, and we've talked about this before, right? This sort of hyperstitional engine of history is actually locked into our neurological biology, because the engine of history requires you to conserve or territorialize around certain dispositions or viewpoints. And then when that specific disposition is contradicted by the flux and flow of life, your mind will employ a cognitive dissonance aspect, essentially, to negate that differentiation and can have you continue on that same course. No, the God of the Bible has to be the one true God. Doesn't matter what you say. And the better you are at doing that, the also better you are at identifying threats and problems and how to deal with them. So the more you open yourself up to the flux and flow of life, and open yourself up to differentiation and consideration of multiple viewpoints, your brain's ability to identify threats and problems and solutions for them decrease. So what we have here is we have two sides of a duality within humanity based upon your specific neurology, where people are going to fall sort of on either disposition of conservative or liberal, and then this is going to be that dialectic that gets pulsated back and forth and drives history forward. This is part of our massive cranial development. If we're talking about an evolutionary standard, they say happened somewhere around 800,000 years ago or so, when we departed from Neanderthals. From that specific scientific framework, where with that story, right, of evolution, is that one of the main things that makes us different and puts us on a hyper accelerative drive is the PMFC portion of our brain, which makes us susceptible to delusions of belief in certain paradigms or metaphysical situations, conserve around those beliefs, defend those beliefs, and employ cognitive dissonance, so that we can't access any kind of truth about the matter, because the truth is precluded, so that we can stay on a certain warpath, of you, if you will, around a isolated theological, metaphysical, or otherwise, theoretical viewpoint that we are then used to drive into the future. Then you'll have small portions of a society that are more liberal by their own neurology and disposition. And this allows for like the introduction of the new, a deterritorialization. These people are often outcasted, but at critical times, these people sort of come in and bring in new ideas that then change, and people in general then begin, usually through war or some kind of rebellion or collapse, then reset and will inculcate the new idea and conserve around that new idea. And this is the engine of history that drives everything forward. How does this relate to bloodlines? And I'll shut up right here. But how this relates to bloodlines is that this is a genetic situation based on the various genes in terms of the formation of the PMFC, but in particular the FOXP2 gene and its relation to language, which is a method of abstraction of the world. So that depending on your ability, to where you fall on this spectrum of utilization of your PMFC, And that is determines on whether or not you can sort of have an objective, almost bird's eye view of what's happening with your neurology. Those people will be more um, disposed to being able to lead humanity, right? And by lead, I mean like through manipulation and coercion and all these other aspects, because they are aware of this sort of biological dialectic. And depending on certain bloodlines, your ability to employ that those aspects and self-awareness of those aspects, those are going to be done primarily through the transfer of genes through that process, and that's what drives history in a particular direction.
That's absolutely really fascinating regarding, sort of one's liberality or one's predisposition towards liberality and conservatism based upon this PMFC, this prefrontal cortex region of the brain. Um, what's interesting too is that almost indicates that there's there's paradox a paradoxical state, almost like an Ouroboros, similar in fact to a toroidal field, not necessarily in terms of the physics of it, but in terms of the conception of it. So this idea of an enclosed system that just recycles the energy around and around and around, um, maintaining both an equal centrifugal and centripetal sort of force, right? Meaning it generates a wheel, or quote unquote a donut or a torus, and that torus is fed by, of course, this centripetal force, right? You see this within Bataille's work and Land's work, the mouth to anus axis. But
Mm-hmm.
in a similar sense, it's you see the same thing sort of being expressed from the very neurology and neurochemistry of the human mind. So that idea, for example, that we see within the rise and fall of civilizations and primarily empires, because they're the main source of, um, driving force of the engine of history as well. And the idea is that the empire must be open, uh, you know, by its very definition. An empire is that which is a multicultural state. It's, of course, it controls one or more peoples at a time. Um, but of course, the ruling elite are usually of a distinct people group. They may even be a minority people group, until eventually, of course, that openness to ideas eventually turns into an openness of foreign demography. And then eventually this causes social fracturing, coupled with other sort of societal entropy or decay present in the empire, and then it collapses. Um, but what's interesting too, both liberality and conservatism, they almost play a mutually com- a mutually comprehensive role in terms of both giving rise to the empire, or the social organism, the civilization, and then putting pay to it, which is interesting because it almost indicates that human beings, firstly, either, of course, civilization was established by a sort of philosopher priest class, a ancient, astronomer
Mm-hmm.
class, or an ancient uh, um,
Mm-hmm.
sort of intelligentsia, that they understood deeply through observation these susceptibilities in mankind themselves, and then establish civilization vis-a-vis this understanding, or, of course, that civilization is entirely invasive, uh, perhaps from a transdimensional um, a group, or group of entities. But it's interesting because you see the same thing. It's almost to maintain this toroidal field. It's to maintain the motion of history, which is being artificially spun through mankind's own vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities themselves are inherent to our own mind. There was something else I was wanting to ask regarding um, the very strange sort of chromosomal anomalies that you see with human beings, and I wanted to get your take on this and the idea of potential ancient genetic engineering. So I
Mhm.
wrote this on the prison planet, and this is just a short excerpt from it. Um, so, for example, and I am unsure if the original proponent of the theory mentions it, but humans look as though we have been genetically edited some time ago. For instance, humans have 46 chromosomes and apes have 48, which consequently poses problems for the idea of strict natural macroevolution between these two species. However, that aside, we find that there has been considerable splicing and pasting, I put that in quotation marks, on this second pair of chromosome within human beings. The karyotypic difference here is so profound that even modern science has trouble explaining this quite stark distinction. They have put it down to a fusion, splicing and pasting of two ancestral chromosomes to form human chromosome 2, and then the subsequent inactivation of one of the two original centromeres. Moreover, the telomeres, the ends of the chromosomes, are also in the middle of chromosome 2 and are in an inactive state. What caused this? Well, the only possibility is either ancient gene editing to quote unquote patch or weaken our enhanced primate strength and further cause us to become more mentally acute. This may have been to work more effectively with complex machinery or technological contraptions, but that would be mere speculation. Or alternatively, within the prior resets, they, the ruling class, were attempting what they seem to be doing now via perhaps needlecraft and other mediums, gene editing and perfecting a self regulating slave class. And then I sort of tied this in with the prison planet theory, quote unquote. What's your take upon that? And is this sort of susceptibility that we see within the neurochemistry of mankind, of course, coupled with all of our other susceptibilities to the base, even the basic climate of Earth itself, you know, without tools, without all of these implements that we use, attire, all of this, we couldn't survive on Earth.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
we are totally at the mercy of the efficiency of our own mind in crafting tools for our survival. But we're also at the mercy of all of these other sort of acute problems in our neurochemistry. So do you think it's artificial? Do you think it's an invasive thing, or what's your opinion upon that?
Yeah, yeah. Specifically, the fusions of chromosome 2, right? That is, it's a huge mystery, in the scientific world. They don't understand it. None of the other apes or any other primates have this fusion here at chromosome 2, and it's my understanding is that it's what causes our rapid cranial development, right? It's the reason, one of the reasons why we are born in like a neotenous disposition where we're helpless when we're born, like completely helpless for years, right? And people forget, we live in such a modernized world where you can click a button and set the temperature of the room. You can put something in a freezer and eat it a month later. For most of humanity's existence, the engagement with the brutality of the world and nature was a massive driver of evolution and the development of technology because um, we are completely helpless. No fur, no tough skin, no nails, no claws. We got some decent bite strength, but our teeth aren't that sharp and we can't do much with it. Eyesight's fairly poor considering all other animals, as is our hearing, as is our smell, right? All of our senses are essentially dull when compared to just about every other animal out there. So the only thing we have is our ability for abstraction. And that comes, what, from a physical standpoint, what allows that to happen is rapid development of the cranium, and particularly the neocortex, right, in the front portion of the head. And that's what makes childbirth so painful is that the size of the skull, because it develops so rapidly in the womb, and that's due to fusion of chromosome 2, is that we have these massive skulls. And if you look at a baby, I forgot what the percentage is. It's like 30 or 40% of their body or something like that is their skull.
Yeah.
compared to the rest of their body. So we're all brain, for the most part, and this is what makes childbirth so painful. And that's a whole nother rabbit hole we can go down to, because that actually acts essentially as like an initiatory process for women. They have to face death by going through this process. It's usually not. I mean, a lot of female animals are vulnerable during childbirth, but not like they're going to die, like many women have throughout history, just in the process of a basic childbirth. So, um, and we're physically helpless, but we have this rapid development of abstraction, and it would seem to be artificial to some degree or another. There's definitely something unique about humanity, um, despite what any of these. I don't think anyone's really still really hardcore Darwinist. I mean, maybe, but humanity is definitely unique, and you can find that in chromosome 2. And I know FOXP2 is on, I think, chromosome 7. It's not chromosome 2, but FOXP2, again, as I mentioned earlier, is also critical for language development, and we develop language to a great degree of abstraction. Um, and so these processes, if you take a biological organism like us with all of our great deficiencies, and as I mentioned many times already, as Kant points out in his physical geography, and we're this upright being, right, with binocular vision, this sets a perfect a perfect storm, if you will, of a situation. Perturbative situation of the earth, highly abstractive mind, PMFC, right, with all of these sort of like inherent tensions of the better you can survive, the better you can solve problems, the more susceptible you are to cognitive dissonance and hyper territorialization around specific ideas for which you will not change your disposition. It's primarily, it seems to be like a survival mechanism so that you can bind a group together, like within the Dunbar limit, right? You can bind them around like centralized ideas or themes or mythopoeic situations that they will territorialize around hard. And then there's like a fail-safe mechanism of cognitive dissonance, so that even if it's like, well, I don't know if the god really lives up on the mountain because we went up to the mountain and there was like nobody there. Cognitive dissonance will come in and then like kick in some abstract solution to why the god wasn't up on the mountain when you thought he was up there, to maintain coherence within that Dunbar limit, right? And
Superstition
go
and
ahead.
things such as that. Yeah.
Exactly, to maintain that coherence, because that will, and the reward, the payoff you get that your brain gives you is that it's going to heighten your ability to organize abstract ideas for that problem solving solution. So the return that you get for um, disallowing access to the truth, quote unquote, right, of the situation, that there is no God on that mountain, let's say, the return that you get on that deception that you give yourself is better survivability, which we desperately need. Again, we don't need it now when we're sitting in our AC air conditioned houses. You needed it, 3,000 years ago, though, for sure, right? And so this is the noble lie, Plato. And when you had mentioned this priest class at the top of humanity, I think you're right over the target. And how this relates to bloodlines is, it may be, this is speculation here, but it may be that a or perhaps a few particular bloodlines allows for a genetic expression where the brain, as let's say like transceiver receiver, is able to oscillate between different energetic charges, basically, of the PMFC, to have a mastery over it and an awareness of it. So that then what happens is that people of this particular bloodline are able to sort of manipulate that process within themselves and recognize that process in themselves. And the rest of humanity may, that ability may not come so easily or at all. And then so what ends up happening is that through just purely by genetics, is that the vast majority of humanity would not be able to resist inculcation into two extremes of PMFC activity. And they would not be able to oscillate. They would sort of be, through genetic disposition, sectored off to more conservative or perhaps liberal dispositions and sort of locked into that specific electromagnetic charging of their PMFC in the frontal cortex, caused by chromosome 2 fusion, right? And FOXP2 expression through language. And that would mean that this upper echelon, essentially what turns into a philosopher priest class, essentially has hyper expression of FOXP2 and mastery essentially within chromosome 2, where they, through language and the ability to manipulate perception, and by perception, will, and by will, occurrences in the world, they can manipulate that through the formation of language, and language forms hyperstition. And then, so that these bloodlines would essentially have the gift of gab, if you will, to be able to have an objective view of that PMFC activity. And through that objective view, because they can objectively view it, they can manipulate it. And this is Plato's philosopher kings or philosopher rulers, right? Which Plato
And,
was
and,
himself.
and what I find interesting about that is with the democratization of academia, and this is sort of just a tangential point, but with the democratization of academia, you now no longer have heavy emphasis as you did classically, where of course academia was narrowly open to only the elite of a given society. You had a serious emphasis on rhetoric, and rhetoric was something that was, one of the primary things that you had to learn as part of your syllabus and your curriculum. Now,
Mhm.
that's no longer the case because, again, if yes, they democratize academia, but they democratize academia in a way that just simply provides the sort of veneer that you're educating the people, the working classes, the lower classes. But of course, you still maintain this sort of Ivy League. What's interesting as well, and I know you're sensitive to time, so this will probably be the last question I ask you, man. But so in the Sumerian mythology, we also read in Farrell's Demon and the Echo, and I was reading this just 2 days ago, and it sort of dawned on me this idea, and we see things similar to this cross culturally, cross mythology. I mean, literally across the world. So it states that the Ekar was the mountain temple of Enlil, the chief god, and the demon in the Ekar, Farrell, heavily emphasizes the epic of Ninurta. Ninurta was he was associated, interestingly, with the planet Saturn, and this is in the Lugal-E, where Ninurta battles a monstrous entity called a Sag. A Sag is associated with both mountains and primarily plague, and subsequently reconfigures the quote unquote stones of the Ekar. I had something in my mind in terms of a question to ask you regarding this, which is that what we're seeing here with even Marduk, for example, Marduk overthrowing Tiamat and such, Saturn overthrowing Kalis, or Cronus overthrowing that of Uranus. What we're seeing here is that itself almost this, is it a metaphor or a sort of hidden cryptic allegory associating this neurochemistry or neurochemical mastery that the elite have over their own minds and over these sort of processes of their own minds, and of course other people's minds, so they can thus manipulate it. And what we're seeing here, this overcoming of the evil, either on the mountain or in the cave, or you know, I don't know if there's a connection there. And finally as well, I wanted to mention regarding trauma, because since you brought it up, and this notion of possession via trauma, right? I don't mean possession directly vis-a-vis an entity, but it can also be possession vis-a-vis a zeitgeist, possession vis-a-vis a sort of one's own neurochemistry as well, right? And we find, for example, in the game of Saturn, that Adams explains that sort of channeling these forces requires a violent psychic fracturing. Um, and of course, this mirrors trauma-based mind control. And he states, quote, "The fierceness of the initiatory process shifts the personality into a new mode of experience in itself and reality. The encounter with the divine is essentially an encounter with and possession by a savage god." I found that very interesting. Of course, as well, this may tie in with what we've spoken regarding the serpent patrician classes and dynasties of Europe. Chumbly also mentions something similar in terms of the quote unquote dragon blood. I think he also refers to it as witch blood or witch lines or something like that.
Yeah,
And
witch blood. Yeah.
yeah, witch blood. So I find that really quite interesting. And just as a final quote, I think this is from Farrell's work, The Demon and the Echo. Quote, "If the plasma intelligent life hypothesis be true, then this ability of plasmas to penetrate other matter may also constitute a physical basis for the phenomenon of demonic possession. Could it be that what we're seeing here in terms of the neurochemistry itself and plasma, that they're fundamentally entwined at the hip, and that the way our mind works as a antenna of sorts, a sort of trans-temporal anchor, could that itself be where we're getting this sort of plasma intelligence or plasma possession from? So, for example, the way our minds are functioning themselves, it's not necessarily that we're being possessed by perhaps an external force, but we're being possessed by an imminent internal force, a force that is, I don't want to say omnipresent, but again, part of that idea of the flame imperishable, the secret fire, the ignis centralis. Um, could that be what's going on here? And like what we're saying with the elite, they've simply just understood this deeply. And and of course, that may be where we're getting the whole um, idea that you see in the Book of Enoch and other mythologies regarding this serpent bloodline, this mark of Cain, this witch blood um, notion, and of course the Nephilim. What are your opinions upon that? Oh, and as well, this would tie in with the transgressive rites that the secret societies and ruling elite practice as well, in
Mhm.
terms of the release of biophotonic energies.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, internal or external, I think it could work. It can work either way. Here's this. This is something interesting to note. So the the physical instantiation, like with a human body, tied to that mitochondrial Eros drive, that ATP production of energy, that is gives you that driving force for like immediate causal effect within the world, right? Like Heidegger's ready at hand, like the tool, you grab the tool and you have intention with the tool and you can use that to manipulate the world, hammer and anvil style, right? And that comes from that physicality, that sort of like base material physicality. But in that situation, you would be susceptible to PMFC manipulation, right? Now, if we were to say what would the perspective be of a plasma intelligence, it would not be hindered by PMFC, right? Because PMFC is a physical phenomenon in terms of the attunement of a specific part of the brain that's going to pick up or send and receive signal basically in terms of um, regulation into conservative or liberal dispositions and the benefits and detriments that come with both positions from the PMFC perspective, right? So, but a plasma intelligence can almost give, what does it give to the embodied person, right? It can grant to that embodied person perhaps a more objective view or objective ability to deal with the oscillation of PMFC dispositions.
Oh, I see. I see.
You see, because the plasma is not bound by PMFC, he can grant to the person who is bound by PMFC objectivity with the PMFC. So that's why
Hmm.
that's and this could be an internal disposition. It could very well be that this is simply we can call it an evolutionary adaptation through certain bloodlines that allows for objective or an abstraction of the abstract, a second layer abstractive ability to modulate aspects of PMFC so that you can then have a mastery or control over um, basically the course of history, your own personal course of history. And if you get into a position of leadership in a political disposition, and you see this when you read Aristotle, that's what Aristotle's talking about, getting into a political disposition where then you can then have a mastery over the polis, the collective, because they either genetically do not have this ability, right? They're barred from it. They're blocked from it. They can't perceive the world outside of where their PMFC's frequency locks them into. But you can, and that is possible. That could be purely a genetic thing. It could be something external that can come into or and act in a symbiotic relationship with the physical and let's say like the plasmic, and then that integration then would allow for this mastery of language and mastery of objectivity of PMFC, which ipso facto creates a elite philosopher class.
Yeah,
And then
almost
the
by default. Yeah. Sorry, man.
by default, right? No, no, by default. And then the noble lie is um, produced and employed, and the people don't know none any the wiser because they're locked into PMFC. They cannot conceive of a situation um, outside of that constraint. And if you take away that constraint, right? They like if you hamper PMFC and an energy, basically its ability to do its thing, they become super liberal and open. Now connect this into biodigital situations, where through HARP and nanotech and everything else, you can modulate in 5G and 6G, you can modulate frequencies and you can turn on or off PMFC abilities. Now we're looking at a situation where you have a total you can have a much greater ruling of the people, and not just because you institute certain laws, but you can directly modulate PMFC activity. And it may be that, again, it could be an internal purely genetic disposition, and that could be artificial. That could be something, sure, that some other intelligence inserted into the human genome with the express purpose of producing these bloodlines, or it could be just arising within. This is what the universe does: is that it's going to, through selection pressure, right, within a perturbative environment and through trauma, cause this to cause these specific lines to emerge. Right, these things will emerge. These lines will emerge, and these people, by definition, are going to be able to outsmart, because the serpent is more cunning than all the other animals. Right, through that cunningness, they're able to basically outsmart and objectively move through the implementation of language and manipulate the polis, right? Dunbar limit and to the Dunbar limit. And then as technology increases, you start moving beyond Dunbar limit because you
I
then have mass media.
you could also I've also got this hypothesis that perhaps you can use trauma and trauma-based mind control, and I think it was Pennick that discussed the locus terribilis, this terrible place, this which almost is like what you're saying, that the majority are extant within this due to global wars, all of the various hyperstitional um, engines of the media, the trauma, all of that. It almost allows one to go beyond the Dunbar number. In fact, we see this with, well, one example is the Spartans. I mean, the Spartans had this it was almost, this sort of masochistic culture, and that itself produced trauma. You also had things like pederasty and other very horrendous things go on in that culture, and it almost established this trauma-based mind control, which allowed them to go beyond the Dunbar number and to maintain this artificial state of things. And in a similar
Right.
way, we have this with the Empire of Spectacle, for example, the West and the US and things like that. So absolutely.
Yeah, because excessive trauma will um, basically hyper energize the PMFC, right? Because
Hmm.
there's a problem that needs to be solved because I'm dying, right? Through multiple traumatic experiences, right? Is what the brain thinks, and so it's going to push that it pushes that PMFC into this like hyperactive state, and it may be that the elite would be maybe one of the things that they would essentially be granted is they they're able to maintain a balance through traumatic situations through an objectivity and less of a subjective experience through that PMFC. It may be through more of a an objective state, so that the trauma wouldn't be so effective towards them. It would be employed upon the masses, and then you can move as they do move people into conservative and liberal states as that fluctuation sort of goes forth, and it creates a difficult situation because if people are physically bound, you know, towards certain dispositions of like cognitive dissonance, it's very difficult because when that PMFC is increased, that activity is increased, cognitive dissonance is at the ready for any contradiction, so they can't sort of be reasoned with, right? Because the moment you try to reason with them, cognitive dissonance comes in as that sort of like auto defender and just negates any sort of position, countering proposition you'd give them, or evidence, or argument, or anything else. So it sort of locks people in, and this is required for the engine of history because you can't have everybody deterritorialized. You can't have everybody just liberally running around, open up to everything, not just running naked through the forest just for fun, because then nothing gets done, and humanity would actually die off because we wouldn't have any problem solving ability, right? So the very thing that keeps us in existence is the very thing that drives the engine of history forward through cognitive dissonance and territorialization around specific um, metaphysical or propositional abstract ideas and concepts. Because we can't survive on our own, reversing everything we just talked about, right? Going back to the very thing, we can't survive on our own. We are social creatures who need social interaction, but we also need the social, we need the polis, we need the political environment to survive and interact, right? With the hostilities of the environment we're in. So we're locked in. Like there's nowhere that you can, that's like the soul trap, quote unquote, right? The soul trap is that you are locked in a situation where you have to be a part of the polis, you have to be part of that entire group. It's required for your existence, and if that goes away, humanity goes extinct. And if you don't submit to cognitive dissonance and a specific like mythic interpretation of the world or objective or whatever you want to say, a superstitional disposition, you cannot survive on a long-term level. Your society will collapse. And since they've taken us through a hyper liberal phase over the last like 10 or 20 years, they've now brought at least America back to a conservative because they need that for war, right? But they had to
Yeah.
deterritorialize everything, right? And when we went through that deterritorialization process, what happened? Everything fell apart. Birth rates drop. Everyone's like sick. Everyone's got jabbed. Just everything's a mess. There's no all the social orders falling apart. Why? Because they are deterritorializing everybody. Now they're rallying everybody back up to conservatism, but the country's done, right? So you need that in order to survive. So you need God, king, and country, right? If you don't have that, nature will eat you, like literally, right? But that very God, king, and country, that's noble lie. And you'll defend it with cognitive dissonance to the death, depending on PMFC activity and extreme subjectivity in PMFC, or if you can obtain some kind of objectivity. But that's maybe a different discussion. So, but hey, I got a jet. But we're gonna have to talk more on this.
Absolutely, man. Yeah, this was a fascinating conversation. Thank you for your time. I was listening intently. I wasn't expecting it to go this way, so it surprised me. It was, but I think this sort of that PMFC thing is actually sort of it's startled me in a good way. I'll have to look into this more. It's very interesting, and and especially how you just tied it in with deterritorialization, because I've been looking into Deleuze slightly as well. So, um,
Hmm.
I thank you for your time, man. I thank you for the generosity of your time yet again. And
Sure,
yeah, we
sure.
will absolutely continue this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and Deleuze is going to be real good. Deleuze is going to show you that he's going to show you that engine of potentiality, actuality, territorialization, deterritorialization. That's the engine of human history, right? That's the engine of your mind, essentially. And now understanding that, hacking that, gaining some objectivity of it. Now this is know thyself, right? Now this is
Hmm.
that ultimate goal there. But we'll chat soon.
Right, man. Thank you very much. I really appreciate
Yeah, no
that. Have
problem.
a good one, bro.
Take care. You too.
Bye.
Bye.